In 1952, a Bible conference was held in the Sligo Seventh-day Adventist Church from September 1 to the 13th. I was present as a delegate from the Southern Union Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. Various topics were presented at this Bible conference. As you recognize, a number of days were involved, and there were several topics presented each day. One topic was assigned to Elder Arthur S. Maxwell, the author of the Bedtime Stories and editor of the Signs of the Times. And that topic was the imminence of Christ's second coming. And in the presentation of this subject, he listed 3 unfulfilled areas of Bible prophecy. The developments that were to take place in the United States, the developments in Palestine, and the 7 last plagues. Now, what he had to say about the developments in Palestine are most interesting. And I read from the Firm Foundation, Volume 2, page 230 and 231, exactly what he had to say about the developments in Palestine. Now, keep in mind that this Bible conference was in 1952, and that in 1948, just 4 years prior, the Jewish state had been set up. In the light of that background, notice what he says. The recent dramatic restoration of the nation of Israel has focused the attention of mankind once more upon Palestine. Many Christians have mistakenly permitted themselves to believe that the return of thousands of unconverted Jews to their native land is a fulfillment of the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not realizing that since the death of the Son of God on Calvary, there is no salvation, nor any eternal homeland, except for those who believe in Him and accept His sacrifice. However, there is one prophecy concerning Palestine that we should all be watching with special care. Said Jesus, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Luke 21:24. For 19 centuries, Jerusalem has been trodden down of the Gentiles. It is still trodden down of the Gentiles, despite the amazing prowess of the Israeli troops. The ancient city of Jerusalem is still in Arab hands. Now, he's writing from the viewpoint of 1952. A Mohammedan mosque still stands upon the site of Solomon's temple. Victorious as were the forces of Israel in every other part of Palestine, they failed to take the most dazzling objective of all. Mysteriously, they were held back from achieving this most cherished goal, this culminating triumph, as by an unseen hand. What could be the reason? Only that the times of the Gentiles are not yet fulfilled. Centuries ago, Israel was not permitted to enter Palestine for a certain time because the iniquity of the Amorites was not yet full. That is, not until the probationary time allotted to the Amorites had run out. It may well be that the same principle applies today on a wider scale. If so, then Jerusalem is to remain trodden down by Gentiles till the probationary time of all Gentiles has run out. If this be correct, how much hinges upon the fate of this ancient city and the power that occupies it? In 1952, the ministry of the Seventh-day Adventist Church was alerted in regard to Luke 21:24. Now, these studies that were given at that Bible conference did not carry the imprimatur of the General Conference of the Church. However, the theologians of the church and the administrative heads from the world field were all present at that Bible conference. It's interesting to note what Dr. Reebok, who was secretary of the Bible conference, had to say in an introductory remark in Volume 1 of the book. The General Conference as a body is in no way responsible for the studies presented. They are not an official pronouncement of the church. They do, however, represent the best thinking on the part of sincere, honest, earnest, devoted, loyal men, Seventh-day Adventists first, last, and always, who have tried to give expression to our conception of the great truths believed, held, and taught by Seventh-day Adventists generally in all parts of the earth. And then Branson enumerated who was going to be there. He says the members of the General Conference Committee who will be in attendance at the 1952 Biennial Council and others who may be invited to the Council from North America, 2 Bible teachers from each senior college, 1 Bible teacher from each junior college, 1 to as many evangelists from each union conference as there are local conferences in the union to be appointed by the respective union committees, the editors of our leading periodicals, the book editors of our leading publishing houses, and representatives from the theological seminary and from overseas divisions, a minimum of 3 in addition to the president of the field. In other words, it was a gathering of the notables of Adventism that came to that 1952 Bible conference. And it was at that 1952 Bible conference that Arthur S. Maxwell called attention to Luke 21:24, alerting the ministry of the church. Since I was there, I can tell you what happened in my case, and I think it happened in the case of all. I heard, but I did not hear. It went in one ear and out the other because of the conditioning that we as ministers had been given in regard to the Jews returning to Palestine. Now, later, I find that in the Bible study courses given to prospective members in one of the most recent issues of the 20th Century Bible Course, lesson number 5, entitled Time Running Out, this very thing is declared as fulfilled prophecy. The second question reads, what sign did Jesus give that would indicate when the destruction of the city was at hand? Speaking of Jerusalem. And they give the text, Luke 21:20, and then they have this note. The city of Jerusalem was surrounded by the Roman armies in AD 66. After a period of time, the army withdrew, and the Christians, recognizing the sign given by Christ, fled the city and did not return. In AD 69, the Romans returned and destroyed the city in AD 70. Nearly 1 million people died or were sold into slavery at that time, but not a single Christian died. They watched for the sign Christ had given and obeyed His instructions. The temple was burned to the ground as Christ had foretold. Even though the soldiers had orders not to destroy it, Christ foresaw the future and outlined it to His followers so that they could be saved. Now this is their comment in view of that first sign. The next question, how long did Christ say that Jerusalem would be trodden down? Verse 24. And then the note. Old Jerusalem and the temple site had been occupied largely by the Gentile nations until 1967, when the Jews took possession of it in a lightning victory. This portion of Christ's prophecy was fulfilled in our day. This is the teaching to prospective Seventh-day Adventists in the 20th Century Bible Course. Then, as if this was not enough, in 1980, the lessons for the second quarter of the adult division was the witness of Jesus. The author of the Helps book, Christ of the Revelation, noted the fulfillment of Luke 21:24, and let me read you carefully what Zucker has to say about this particular thing on pages 71 and 72. He says, we shall not linger over the numerous signs given by Jesus in this discourse. One only will occupy our attention, the one that especially deals with time. Even in our days, it constitutes a critical point in the political world, Jerusalem. In fact, Jerusalem is both the beginning and culmination of Jesus' prophecy. For him, as for Daniel the prophet, the history of nations as that of the people of Israel is written in the setting of the tragic history of Jerusalem. The latter is the sign by which the fate of the former is determined. So having predicted the destruction of Jerusalem and the dispersion of Jews into all nations, Jesus declared, Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, and the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Luke 21:24. Few today would deny the precision of this prophecy. The destruction of Jerusalem by the Roman armies in AD 70 is a historical fact, commemorated on the triumphal arch of Titus in Rome. The dispersion of the Jews among all nations is still a reality. As for Jerusalem, 19 centuries of history should provide adequate proof that it has been trodden down of the Gentiles. First by the Romans, then by the Arabs, next by different Christian nations during the Crusades, fourth by the Turks up to the end of the First World War, then by the British, and finally by the Jordanians until the Six-Day War in June 1967. This prophecy of Jesus was a sign for the Christians of the Apostolic Church who lived at the beginning of the times of the Gentiles, and it remains a sign for us who live at the end of the times of the Gentiles. Then he goes on to say, as I understand the biblical language, the times of the Gentiles is the period set aside by God for the evangelization of the heathen nations. It is not the time needed for them to be converted to Christianity, as some think, but for them to hear the gospel. It is in this sense that Jesus said, this gospel, the kingdom, shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. I believe that the times of the Gentiles began in AD 34. And if I have understood the prediction of Jesus properly, this time will be fulfilled when Jerusalem shall cease to be trodden down of the Gentiles. The fact that since 1967, Gentiles no longer have occupied Jerusalem means, therefore, that we are now living at the end of the times of the Gentiles. Jerusalem here constitutes the last sign of the times by which the Lord shows us that the history of this world is coming to its climax and that the restoration of all things is at hand. Thus, in 1952, the ministry of the church was alerted, and then in 1980, through the Sabbath school lessons and the helps book, the church was told that the prophecy had been fulfilled. With this background, as found in Adventist literature on this prophecy, it would be irrelevant to spend time in proving its validity for our study. We should seek to discover the significance of this already fulfilled prophecy. We should know and appreciate what Jesus was giving in prophetic legacy to His followers. We should be aware of the large amount of data which verifies its fulfillment. We shall discuss the last 2 points in tonight's study. And then the first point, discovering its significance for us, we shall discuss in the next study. Let's notice the setting of Luke 21:24. Take your Bibles, and as you turn there to Luke 21, you will find that this is indeed a part of the prophecy that Jesus gave to His disciples on the Mount of Olives. Not only is it found in Luke 21, but we find it also in Matthew 24 and Mark 13. In fact, the setting of this prophecy is probably given the best in Matthew 24. And so if you'll go back to the 24th, the 23rd, 24th chapter of Matthew, you will find there that Jesus had pronounced some scathing rebukes upon the Jewish religious leadership right in the temple. And then He pronounced in verse 38 that their house was desolate. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. Now keep in mind, prior to this, just a few days, He had told the Jews, why have you made my Father's house a den of thieves? In the second cleansing of the temple. Now He turns, after cleansing the temple the second time, within a matter of days, He says, your house is left unto you desolate. Well, this stunned the disciples. And in their attempt to bring Jesus back to what they thought was reality, in the 24th chapter it says, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple. And His disciples came to Him for to show Him the buildings of the temple. What did they say? Well, look at here, Jesus. Look at these great big buildings. Look at these rocks that are here. Look at this structure. How can you say that this temple, the center of our religious worship, is desolate? Is going to be set aside. Is going to be forgotten. Is going to be cast aside. Going to be cast down. Then Jesus did not back down 1 inch, but He went on to say, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. The whole thing's going to be thrown down. Silence reigned. That really stunned them. So when they got to the Mount of Olives, possibly 2 to 3 mile walk, it says in the 3rd verse, as He sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto Him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of Thy coming and of the end of the world? As far as they were concerned, if the temple was going to be destroyed, that had to be the end of the world. For as they looked at the temple at that time, the destruction of the temple would indeed be the end of their religious world. Now, in answering this question, Jesus did not say, all right, the temple is going to be destroyed at this particular time, and then the end of time is going to come at another time. He mingled the two events together, giving general signs that would apply to both. But in giving these signs that would apply to both, He specified three distinct signs that would mark major epochs from His day to the coming the second time. He said that there would be a sign that they could note in regard to the destruction of Jerusalem. Notice the 24th chapter of Matthew, verses 15 and 20. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe to them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. And pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Then we find in Luke 21 and verse 20, Luke pictures it in just a little different language. He says, And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. And he goes on to tell them that, Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter therein too. Then he also gave a sign that would mark the transition of His heavenly ministry. Observe in Matthew 24, verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then there was that final sign in Luke 21:24, that Jerusalem would be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles would be fulfilled. Now, the interesting thing about these three signs is simply this. They were not given in symbolism. They were literally specified, and furthermore, they were not connected in a prophetic time period. These were signs that Jesus pointed out so that an individual could look back and say, oh, here's an event, and this fulfills what Jesus said. And then they could ask themselves the question, because that event fulfilled what Jesus said, what is Jesus saying to me now? All these signs were set in this kind of a picture. In fact, we need to apply, or in fact, in so applying that principle, we are applying the same principle to the interpretation of Luke 21:24 that our spiritual pioneers applied to the signs that were given just before the fulfillment of Daniel 8:13 or 8:14. If you'll notice or if you'll follow with me, in a symposium on biblical hermeneutics that's brought together in an edited book by Gordon M. Hyde, Don F. Neufeld, in Biblical Interpretation in the Advent Movement, says this, among the principles that the Adventist pioneers used. Number 6, the Bible must be interpreted according to the plain, obvious, and literal import unless a figure is employed. This rule was a recurring theme at a time when critics attempted to demolish the position taken by the Adventists. All right, the Adventists took the principle that when a prophecy was specific, it had to be interpreted according to its obvious literal meaning unless a figure was employed. And this is what they did in the face of criticism on their interpretations of the book of Daniel. Now there are some definitions that will be very helpful to us so that we can understand what is not being said as well as what is being said. And so if you'll notice on your little sheet of interpretations, you'll find there that on the first one, or the first section of the interpretations, what do we actually mean by the term times of the Gentiles? All right, we mean simply that in 34 A.D., the prophecy that Daniel gave, was given to Daniel, that 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, and that ended in 34 A.D., and when the times of the Jews as a favored nation of God was up, then the times of the Gentiles began. Now, we are not saying, nor do we believe, that Jerusalem after 34 A.D. was a holy city, or would ever be a holy city again, or the nation of Israel was a chosen people of God after that day, or would ever be again. But this does not say that Jerusalem, though no longer a holy city, will not be a sign. Because in the very first sign that Jesus gave, what did He give concerning? Concerning Jerusalem. When you see the alien armies around Jerusalem, then know what? That it's time to get up. So Jerusalem, though no longer a holy city, is nevertheless a sign. A city which in its history can be signs for God's people. Now notice the other part of the definition. Gentiles and nations. In the Greek there's only one word. Ta ethne. The nations or the Gentiles. Now this is important to understand as you read the specific prophecy in Luke. Let's notice Luke 21 verses 24 to 25 and see specifically what it says. Luke 21, 24 and 25. And I'm going to note for you the words. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the ta ethne, either Gentiles or nations, until the times of the ta ethne be fulfilled, either Jews or nations, Gentiles or nations. And there shall be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, and upon earth distress of the ta ethne, Gentiles or nations, with perplexity, the seas and the waves roaring. By understanding it's just one common Greek word, we can therefore understand that between the 24th and the 25th verses, there's a definite connection. In other words, the sign that would show the end of the times of the nations or the times of the Gentiles is also the word that's used to mark the distress of nations or the distress of the Gentiles. And so the two verses then can be understood in better perspective when we understand it's one common Greek word. Then for Jerusalem. Jerusalem is used in three different ways in the Bible and in the spirit of prophecy. It's a literal city. It's the New Jerusalem, the city of God coming down from God out of heaven, and also it's used to refer to the church. We find in Hebrews, the 12th chapter, where it says, "Ye are come unto Mount Zion, to the heavenly Jerusalem, the church of the firstborn whose names are written in heaven." All right, let's notice an analysis of Luke 21:24 itself. The very verse of the words that have to do unto the times the Gentiles be fulfilled. That word until. That word until is akri hu. Akri hu. And let me just put it up here for you. Luke uses this word, akri, 20 times in his Gospel and in the book of Acts. And it's translated with the concept of until. But 3 of those times, he adds the relative, who. Akri, who. And one of the times that he puts this combination together is in Luke 21:24. The other 2 times are in the book of Acts. Now, what this expression means in Luke 21:24, we can better understand if we'll turn to the book of Acts. Let's notice in Acts, the 7th chapter and verse 18. Acts 7, verse 18. Till, that's Akrihu, another king arose which knew not Joseph. Now in context. But when the time of promise drew nigh, which God had sworn to Abraham, the people grew and multiplied in Egypt. Akrihu, or until another king arose which knew not Joseph. The same dealt subtly with our kindred. Now is it saying that immediately upon the ascension of this new king, the Israelites were put in bondage? No. Is conveying that there was a brief period of time between the ascension of this new king and the rules that were used against the Jews, or the children of Israel. Now if you'll turn to Acts 27, verse 33, it becomes even clearer as far as the use of the expression is concerned. Acts 27, verse 33. This is Paul on the way to Rome in the shipwreck. And Paul told them in verse 31 that everybody had to stay on the ship. Verse 32 says, the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. And while the day was coming on, while, Akrihu, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, This day is the 14th day that ye have tarried, continued fasting, and have taken no bread. Wherefore I pray you take some food. All right, while the day was coming on, akrihu. And several times on trips, as we've started out early in the morning at dark. Pretty soon, traveling either north or south, we could see on the eastern horizon just a little glimmer of light. And in just a little while, the sun arose and all darkness fled. Akrihu, while the day was coming on. So Luke uses this compounded expression, this idiomatic expression as far as the Greek is concerned, to convey a small but definite period of time involved. And so he says that the times of the closing of the times of the Gentiles, the fulfillment, will be a very brief, specified period of time. Now this time also marks the distress of nations with perplexity, even as the signs in the heavens mark the time for the events to begin in heaven as noted in prophecy. And so we ask ourselves simply the question, what does it mean? Those signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. What do those signs mean? Well, we've thought of them as meaning what? Marking the coming of the second coming of Christ. But look how many years ago they've been. When did they take place? May 19, 1780? November what? November 1833 in the month of November? Long years, generations ago, century ago. But what did they mark? Well, I want to call your attention to a statement in the Spirit of Prophecy. This is Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 4, page 195. This is a comment on this particular thing. And while wholly unconscious of their condition and their peril, the church and the world were rapidly approaching the most solemn and momentous period in earth's history. The period of the revelation of the Son of Man. Already had the signs which Christ Himself had promised, the sun clothed in darkness by day and the moon by night, declared His coming near. What? The period of the revelation of the Son of Man. A period of time. Now, what is the period of the revelation of the Son of Man? We find that as far as the Scripture is concerned, that Jesus comes as the Son of Man in three different ways. Notice in Daniel, the 7th chapter, and there in the 7th chapter you have pictured what we believe is the fulfillment of Daniel 8:14. In the 9th verse it says, I beheld till the thrones were cast down, the Ancient of Days did sit, whose garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was like a fiery flame, and his wheels as burning fire. A fiery stream issued and came forth before him, and thousands upon thousands ministered unto him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The judgment was set, and the books were opened. Now, who came before the Ancient of Days? 13th verse. And I saw in the night visions, and behold, one like the what? The Son of Man. The beginning of the period of the revelation of the Son of Man is the coming of the Son of Man to the Ancient of Days in judgment. All right, those signs in the heavens marked an act on the part of God in the heavens. Now then, we find that the second revelation of the Son of Man is His revelation in humanity for what is to take place before He comes. Christ in you, the hope of glory. But when will that be? Turn to Isaiah, the 13th chapter, and notice a very interesting prophecy. Isaiah 13. And if you'll observe there in the 13th chapter of Isaiah, the 12th verse first, and let's notice the setting of that 12th verse. I will make a man more precious than fine gold, even a man than the golden wedge of Ophir. Now, when's that going to take place? 10th verse says, For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. What's those signs? The same things that Jesus said were the signs of the heavens. Then He says He's going to make a man more precious than gold, the golden wedge of Ophir. Then the 13th verse says, Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth shall remove out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts in the day of His fierce anger. When's that? The 7 last plagues. Thus, between the signs of the heavens and the 7 last plagues, God's going to make a man more precious than gold and the golden wedge of Ophir. Christ is going to complete a work in man. The revelation of the Son of Man, the reflection of the image of Jesus fully in humanity. And then what's the third revelation of the Son of Man? In Revelation, the 14th chapter, connected with the three angels' messages, here's what we find. Revelation, the 14th chapter, beginning with the 14th verse. Revelation 14:14 to 16. And I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like whom? The Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, Thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. And he that sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. The period of the revelation of the Son of Man. Now what about the significance that upon earth, distress of nations? See, we take the signs and look to heaven. And then on the earth, distress of nations. Those words likewise are most interesting as far as the picture is concerned. There is the word Sunake. I see I have to change it just briefly. It's an omicron instead of an alpha. Sunake means there imprisoned in the narrows, in the straits, distress, being pressed in, going through the narrows. And then it says, distress with perplexity. And that's a prepositional phrase, in aporia. I think I have that one right, yes. And that prepositional phrase in the Greek and in the writings, the other writings of the times written in the same language of the New Testament, the Koine, gives the idea unable to meet the demands placed on an individual financially. It is an inability to solve a monetary crisis. The prophecy indicates that the distress of nations will have to do with economic problems and factors that are going to be involved with the nations and among the nations. Then there's one final overall picture that we dare not overlook. Each generation of the three major signs believed that they had reached the end time. Even the generation prior to the destruction of Jerusalem perceived of that time as the end time. In fact, you realize that when Paul wrote the book of 1 Thessalonians, the Thessalonians thought that that meant that Jesus was coming in their day, and he had to write the second book of Thessalonians to the church at Thessalonica to tell them, just a minute, there are certain signs that have to take place before that event will come. They were looking for Jesus to come immediately. In fact, notice the language of the New Testament. Turn to Colossians 1:23. And what Paul has to say. Colossians 1:23. And remember, he said, the mystery of iniquity doth already work, when he wrote to the Thessalonians. Now, he says here in Colossians 1:23, if ye continue in the faith, grounded and settled, and be not moved away from the hope of the gospel, which ye have heard, and which was preached to every creature which is under heaven, whereof I, Paul, am made a minister. He says the gospel had been preached to whom at that time? Every creature under heaven. What did Jesus say? And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world as a witness unto all nations, and what? Then shall the end come. In other words, they were looking for the coming of the Lord, and they thought they had met the specification. Now, let's go one step further. In Hebrews, the first chapter, you find that there, right in the very beginning of the book of Hebrews, it says plainly that God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in times past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these what? Last days. They perceived the times that they were living as the last days. All right? There was that concept involved with that sign that had to do with Jerusalem. Now, let's notice, well, what about the time before the fulfillment of the hour of judgment in 1844? What were the people looking for? What was being preached? That Christ was coming. They expected Him to come October 22nd, 1844. Now, I find that as I go about, even in this present hour, there are individuals conscious. They can't explain it. But there are individuals all over that conscious that something's going to happen. This present order cannot continue. That we're at a time when things are about to break up. In other words, the same concept, even by individuals that used to scoff at the end, are stating those various things in many, while some of them still have their doubts. This is the picture that we see today. Now, Jesus said, in relationship to these signs, notice carefully, in Luke 21, verses 32 to 33, "So likewise ye, when ye shall see these things come to pass, know that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away." These words applied with equal force to each generation that lived at the time of the fulfillment of those first two major signs. And let's just notice, you look at your diagram, and we can also diagram it here on the blackboard. As far as the thing is concerned, let's just take a timeline here. We'll put the cross, 34, and then we come up here to 66, and then 70. All right? Did those living in Jerusalem in 66 A.D., who saw the sign of the Roman armies coming around that city, did they live to see the destruction of Jerusalem? Absolutely. Really it was 3.5 years actual time, 4 short years by counting the chronology of the years. They saw it fulfilled. Now if you'll take the timeline also and notice the other sign, that was the signs in the heavens that marked the beginning of the period of the revelation of Jesus Christ. You have 1780 and 1833. All right, between these two, 11 years and approximately 60 years in here. A generation. The generation that lived in that period of time heard the message, proclaiming as we had reached the end time that there was to be the cleansing of the sanctuary. Now under those circumstances, then we come to Luke 21:24, and this brings us to the data which gives evidence of the fulfillment of this prophecy. And let's take a close look at that particular data. One of the items that I have found that mark out very closely is an article that was in the March 1975 Reader's Digest. And this article was "Jerusalem Too Holy for Its Own Good." And this is what this writer had to say. "A stone wall rising starkly in the walled city figures strongly in Israel's adamantcy over not wanting to give up East Jerusalem. This is the western wall, a fragment of the western rampart of a platform on which the first temple of King Solomon and the second temple of King Herod stood. The second temple was destroyed by the Romans in AD 70 when the Jews were driven into diaspora or dispersion. Throughout 19 centuries of diaspora, the wall or memory of it served as a spiritual beacon and a symbol of the lost homeland of Jews the world over. During that time, Passover and Yom Kippur services ended with the incantation in Hebrew, 'Next year in Jerusalem.' The Israeli argue that they have every right to East Jerusalem. And when the British withdrew from Palestine in 1948, the Jews and Arabs fought over the control of the state. The Jews managed to hold West Jerusalem and proclaimed it the capital of the new state of Israel. Yet tantalizingly, the western wall remained just beyond reach. Jordan annexed East Jerusalem as well as the west bank of the River Jordan, a territory that surrounds the city on 3 sides. For 19 years, a no man's land separated the 2 sectors, and Jordanians refused to allow Jews to worship at the western wall. When war came again in 1967, Israel urged Jordan's King Hussein to stay out of it, promising in return not to attack Jordan. But egged on by Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser and other Arabs, Hussein sent artillery shells crashing into West Jerusalem. Israeli soldiers counterattacked and poured into the walled city. Their religious fervor was such that many headed directly for the western wall, where they paused for prayer. For the first time in 19 centuries, the wall was under Jewish control. Now that's the viewpoint of an individual writing in Reader's Digest concerning Jerusalem and the taking of that sacred spot to the Jews. Now what about the financial woes? that the world is facing and has faced for some time. I bring you several statements as far as the financial picture is concerned involving the present condition. This is written by Myers of the C.V. Myers, a well-known Canadian financial expert who I believe used to operate out of Calgary. And he's recognized in the London Financial Times for his ability. And he has said this in particular. He says, it has now been established, and this was written in July 4th, 1974, it has now been established over the course of the last 7 years, since 1967, that there is nothing in this world the international monetary authorities can do to stem the advance of gold or to stem the collapse of the inflation or to avoid the enormous deflation, the global liquidity crunch, and the resulting depressions. Don't doubt this. The monetary morons have demonstrated to you time and time again, fail, fail, fail. Then again, in March 1, 1975, he says this, from all that I've observed of international conferences, and this he's talking about the International Monetary Fund conferences, all that I've observed of these international conferences since 1967, I do not believe that any conference is going to come up with a workable answer. It seems that the situation will just continue to deteriorate. Only 6 months ago, we heard every monetary authority in the world shouting, either we lick inflation or we're doomed. This is the battle of the century. Then he refers to President Ford at that time, says, we have a war and we intend to fight this war against inflation. And the way he's fighting the war against inflation is to add a 70 to 100 billion deficit to the United States budget. That sounds very, almost foreign to what the situation is today over this matter of inflation and yet a budget. And then he goes on to say, what happened to all the dire predictions of the result of inflation? All brains have been stunned. They see no answer. So now they begin to think no answer is necessary. Or at least they have decided there's no use thinking about it at all. Therefore I can see only as the end product, as I have repeatedly said in these letters, and especially after attending the big world meetings of the IMF, the answer is a total collapse. And then he goes on to say, quoting the French authority, the man in economics who later became their premier, the world is unhappy. It's unhappy because it doesn't know where it's going, and because it senses that if it did know, it would discover that it was heading for disaster. The crisis the world knows today will be a long one. It's not a passing difficulty. It is actually the recognition of a permanent change. And he says that the governments that will take place in the collapse of the thing, these governments will be dictatorships. And then in May 24th, 1976, he says here, an enormous war has been going on between the forces of paper and the forces of gold since 1967, when the SDRs were first proposed. The main offenses on the paper side have been the International Monetary Fund's recommendation of special drawing rights in 1967. And then in another page, April 23, 1976, he says, since 1967, gold has been walking a tightrope. And then I know you all recall the thing in California on Proposition 13 where it says there was a revolt, vote for this particular thing on taxes. And down here at the bottom of this report in Newsweek, there was this sentence that I underlined. Since 1967, the value of the dollar has declined 47.6%. Since 1967. In other words, 1967 is the year that's used to measure the basis of the dollar against either rise or fall. Now why? Distress of nations with perplexity tied in with the times of the Gentiles or the times of the nations. And here we have the facts laid out that the very economic base for the value of the dollar is based on the dollar of 1967. And as we leave the financial, we come to the religious world. And one of the main things of interest is the Catholic charismatic movement and what's happened to it. In Christianity Today, there was a large article in the June 6th issue, 1975, about celebration of the Pentecost Sunday in St. Peter's in Rome, and how on that particular day in Rome, while the Pope was speaking at the Mass, and even though the charismatics that were present were in a minority, In the throngs that filled the church, there was spontaneous singing of the charismatic anthem, Alleluia, competed with the pipe organ at the beginning and at the end of the service. And at the consecration of the host, a soft murmur of the singing in the Spirit, that's chanting in harmony and glossolalia, filled the cathedral. In other words, there was actually a tongues demonstration right in the very heart of Roman Catholicism. But an earlier issue of Christianity Today, and this issue is June 22, 1973, said this: on the surface, the big story is still the movement's phenomenal growth from its beginnings among a handful of mostly young persons at a retreat in 1967 on the Duquesne University campus in Pittsburgh is where the whole thing began. 67. And on into the very heart of Roman Catholicism. And then there's the matter of raw Spiritism itself. And this has never failed to interest me. That the year 1967 marks a historic milestone for the United States toy industry. Why should toys figure into a prophecy, 1967? Well, in that year, John Godwin, in his book, Occult America, in the chapter on the occult gold mine, says that in that year, Americans ditched their longest-standing favorite among the board games, Monopoly, and substituted in its place the Ouija board. 67, the Ouija board became the favorite board game of the Americans. And he goes on to tell the situation there. And I had a unique experience down in Jackson, Mississippi, when I went into the large department store in the North Mall, Gaffer's. As I was coming down the escalator from the second floor, I noticed over here in a place they sold books where they said a special. And I'm always interested in specials, what specials are. And so I walked around there, and there was piled high, about waist high, 3 deep, 3 sections, the book, the game Monopoly. In other words, they were selling it out cheap. Then it so happened that that day I walked out the front of the store instead of going back into the Mall Avenue. And there in the window were the latest fashions displayed for that time of the year. And there, laying on the floor in the fashions, was a Ouija board. Very interesting, the transition that came as far as those games were concerned. Then there's the hippie movement. And when I gave this study at one time here in northwest Arkansas at an institution, there were some young individuals that had come from the hippie background, and they were very interested in what I was saying about 1967. And so after I got home, one of the young men up there sent me a copy out of the World Book Encyclopedia, the 1968 yearbook, which would tell what happened before. And this is what he said, and what he underscored, or what he showed to me. Eastern influence. Finally, news of non-Western religion came to the West in 1967 through the efforts of individuals and groups that might be described as commuters between value systems. The hippie phenomenon, which reached a peak in midsummer, was an example. Hippies turned to Zen Buddhism, the Vedas, the writings of Rabbi Hillel, and the teachings of Jesus, implying that these could provide meaning for a non-violent generation. The Beatles were the best known of the celebrities who turned to the Eastern religion as they sought transcendental meditation through contact with the yogi, their chosen spiritual leader. Timothy Leary advocated a religion based not only on mind-expanding drugs like LSD, but also on literary resources of Eastern religion. Now, when this young man sent it to me, he wrote this note. This does not necessarily say that these things began in 67. That would be hard to define and could create controversy. The fact is, these things reached their peak in 1967, and that stands without controversy. Now turn to Isaiah, the 2nd chapter, and notice what it says there in that prophecy, Isaiah 2. You'll find at the beginning of that chapter there in Isaiah 2 that it says, and it shall come to pass in the last days that the Lord's house shall be established in the tops of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow into it, and many people shall go and say. And they say, come and let us beat our swords into plowshares. In other words, a non-violent generation. But what does God say? The 6th verse. Therefore thou hast forsaken thy people, the house of Jacob, because they be replenished from the east. and are soothsayers like the Philistines. Here in this prophecy of Isaiah, which marks the last days, when nations are going, and nations shall say, not the governments, but the people shall say of the nations, we're going to have a non-violent generation. What does God say? All you are replenished from the east. And this is exactly what this World Book Encyclopedia said, that in 1967 it reached its height in a non-violent generation, turning to what? The East for their sources of inspiration. That's not all. Now we come to another aspect of the fulfillment, and this also is in a yearbook, World Book Encyclopedia for 1968, and it has to do with the Protestant religion. And notice carefully. It says here Protestant. World Protestantism celebrated its 450th anniversary in 1967 and encountered some of the most troublesome issues in its history. Most Protestants consider October 31, 1517 as the symbolic beginning of the Reformation. On that day, Martin Luther issued his 95 Theses criticizing the Roman Catholic Church and pointing toward a fresh understanding of God's grace. In October 1967, Protestants gathered quite often with Roman Catholics in countries throughout the world to recall that event. And here today, we're finding that we're living now in the anniversary celebration of the birth of Martin Luther. And Catholicism is joining right into the whole picture, even the Pope preaching in a Lutheran chapel in the city of Rome. And when did that start in this unification back? 1967, as far as the picture is concerned. Then there was an editorial sent to me. And when I received this editorial from the West Coast, it appeared in the Oroville Mercury Register for Thursday, May 7th, 1976, as I read it here. I read it and then I laid it aside. I said, dare I bring it out in public? Because it was most unusual. It was written by Jeffrey Hart on Carter and religion. And one interesting paragraph said, quoting Carter, in 1967, says Carter, I had a profound religious experience that changed my life. He said in 67 he had an experience that changed his life. And that brings us now to the consideration of the possible end of the period of the Acre Hu. We have the beginning well marked, tabulated, documented, with as much evidence as they ever had for the falling of the stars of the dark day. Now what about the end of the period? And I must confess that when I first gave this study on Luke 21:24, and then opened it for discussion, I almost literally prayed, Lord, don't let them ask me one question. And that one question was this: can you point to where the United States has gone into full apostasy so that it can be followed by national rule? And in 1967, there was no such evidence that I could put my finger on. But, interestingly, the man who in 67 had a profound religious experience was in 1979 in the White House. And what occurred at that particular time? And this is interesting. In the Time magazine, the Pope in America, the picture that's in the magazine is not merely Carter shaking hands with the Pope. It's Carter clasping the hands of the Pope as he brings him into the White House. And then I remember the statement that was written in the General Conference Bulletin of Volume 4, number 19, April 13, 1891. It is at the time of national apostasy, when, acting on the policy of Satan, the rulers of the land will rank themselves on the side of the man of sin. It is then the measure of guilt is full. The national apostasy is to be the signal for national ruin. What was the statement? When acting on the policy of Satan, If the times of the nations are fulfilled, and that beginning in 67, then is God controlling their decisions, or what policies are they following? The policies of Satan. And when acting on the policies of Satan, the rulers of the land, that's our land, rank themselves on the side of the man of sin. All right, what happened in this particular time in 79? The Religious News Service said this. It was the first time not only that a pope had visited the White House, but the first time that any pope had called on a governmental leader anywhere. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson came to New York City to greet the Pope, that's Paul VI, during his 14-hour visit to the city, primarily for address to the United Nations. The only other time that a pope has visited the United States. But this time, what did the Pope do? He didn't wait for a political dignitary to come to him. He came to the President of the United States, and the President of the United States took him where? Into the White House. And your Religious News Service says, President Carter welcomed the pontiff to the historic White House meeting, saying, I welcome you to the White House, the symbolic home of all our people. On behalf of every American, of every faith, I also welcome you into our nation's heart. God bless you for coming to our country. We are proud to have you here. The man that had a profound religious experience in 67. Now, while he was there, and in this particular reception, where there had been sent out over 10,000 invitations, representatives of the judiciary, the one arm of the government, representatives of the legislative, the other arm, and members of the cabinet and the president were all there. In other words, the government was represented. The rulers, plural, of our land. While we have a president, each definite department is a factor. The rulers of our land. Now then, what happened? At the conclusion of the reception, the Pope surprised the audience by saying, the Pope wants to bless you with the permission of the President of the United States. And then what happened? Within a month, America suffered its most humiliating episode in its entire history and couldn't do a thing about it. Our embassy and Americans were held hostage in Tehran. And where have we gone since that date? We are heading on down the road of the economic problems as began in 67. The whole thing is moving on to its finish. Now, how are we relating to all of this? We who have these facts. We who were alerted to them back in 52. We who can see the things fulfilling, living at the very hour when these things are taking place. Here we see in our lifetime a fulfilled prophecy as real as any prophecy which our spiritual forefathers saw fulfilled. Jesus has given no other sign. No other. It is the last generation. In Revelation 12:12 it says, the devil is come down unto you having great wrath because he knoweth that he hath a short time. And so we have a fulfilled prophecy. And may I ask this question? In this matter of fulfilled prophecy, are we unable really to perceive its meaning? Or is the real reason why the difficulty over this prophecy is that we do not wish to accept the implications involved?